Hey, bom dia, everybody. A great pleasure to be with you. Brazil is one of my favorite countries in the world, and I have many friends in Rio and also in Sao Paulo, of course. And my favorite place, really, of all places, is Trancoso in Bahia, which I went to 3 years ago with my wife, and she has become a great fan of Brazil also. And it's kind of funny, we're talking about the good future, and the future of Brazil is, in many ways, many people think that Brazil is kind of the future, right? And it was a really interesting theme 70 years ago. But I always say the next 10 years will bring more change than the previous 100 years. I know it sounds truly crazy when you think about the last 10 years. We've had a lot of change, but think about the next 10 years, right? We're going to see a world where basically 5G mobile networks and cheap mobile devices, even cheap for poor people, right, will mean that roughly we're going to have 90% of the world connected to the internet. Right now it's 4.5 billion, and then it's going to be 9 billion people. Right? And other things that you've seen around us, for example, virtual reality and all of the digital tools are pretty mind-boggling. So I'm going to give a short presentation here first on what I think about the good future, and then we're going to have a discussion and debate about what that means for you. Okay?
Yes,
so
Gerd,
yes.
Well, as I mentioned in our emails, this is a group composed by business and thought leaders of many of Brazil's leading companies. And under this leadership program, we are debating critical issues every month. So this month, for example, our question for debate is, what are the great challenges of our era? What do they mean and how can we deal with them? And on top of that, of course, we have these special sessions with leading thinkers like yourself, who may help us think better about these subjects and act accordingly. So perhaps we can kick off with this conversation with a summary of your vision of what you have called the good future, which actually is the future that all of us want to live in, right? So, and then we can move to a fireside chat with all of us. Sounds good?
So, Il Buon Futuro, the film that I made last year, is a film to address an issue that is everywhere now, is that a lot of people think that the future isn't going to be good. There has a lot of research, especially now because of COVID, of course, but especially young people between 16 and 25. I don't know how many of you have kids or younger kids, but it seems like a lot of people, 90%, in fact, is the research, are mostly worried about the future. And that is for a lot of reasons, not just because of COVID, right? So when I made the film, The Good Future, you can watch that at goodfuturefilm.com. There is a Portuguese subtitle, it's on YouTube and on Vimeo. You can watch it in English, of course. But this is what I address a lot, right? A lot of people are saying, well, the future, right? Is the future really going to be good? There's many things to be excited about, but then there's many other things that are quite scary. And I think it's really funny when we watch the news or when you watch television, that it's kind of a dystopian future, right? Every movie on Netflix ends badly for us. Right? The robots are coming and they're going to take our work and then they kill us and use us for energy, right? And you may have seen the Netflix film Don't Look Up. Very much the same discussion, right? So a lot of people are looking at this, and then we have, of course, the facts here like this, right? Look at this research from the World Economic Forum. I hear somebody typing. Maybe turn off the microphone if you would, please. So now you see this chart here about the risk, right? Look at all of those. I mean, it's a long list of risk. Basically, people are seeing risk pretty much everywhere. Social cohesion, livelihood crisis, climate action failure. It sounds like a very good list here for Brazil also, the concerns that people have about the future. And so basically I always say, well, that's, we hear a lot about this, but I really think the future is better than we think. Because if you look at the reality of things, so many things that have happened that are hopeful. For example, we were able to have a vaccine in 12 months. And now it's difficult to roll out the vaccine because The pharma companies want to keep getting paid, of course, right? And we have practical issues, but we have made huge progress. Right? We are also inventing things all the time. Like now we can make free phone calls and we can use technology to make our lives better. And climate change seems like we're going to be able to address it with technology. For example, if you're looking at Brazil and India, for example, the solar energy is cheaper than coal, right? Already. And now we're building batteries for electric cars where a car can go 1,000 kilometers. And it's basically exploding all around us. So the real challenge that we have, especially in Brazil, is that we will have all the tools and all the science, but do we have the right telos, what's the Greek word, right? Telos means the purpose, the will, the collaboration, the government, right? That's what it's going to come down to. And for companies, that means you as a company have to become a thought leader. And this is different than before COVID. Because now a lot of people are saying, we want to know who that company is and what is your brand and what is your purpose and are you doing something to help society, right? So this idea of business as usual is dead, right? And I think you'll see that happening in Brazil fairly soon. It may be a little bit delayed compared to, say, Europe this year, but this year is the year where business as usual, we recognize, we can no longer think about the COVID crisis or the climate change or inequality or financial things. It's all together. We can't think about it separately anymore. And that is actually good. For example, in the COVID crisis, we have learned how to use technology better for remote calling, for shopping, and if you don't have technology, that is a problem now. And so I think roughly 35 million people in Brazil are in the poverty level. And that's becoming more of a problem now because of technology and the COVID crisis. And that has to be addressed. But as we're moving into the future, there's 3 points. I think every company and every government and every executive has to understand what that means, okay? So we're looking at basically 3 points. One is digitization, right? Using digital technology. Decarbonization, which means to switch to green energy. Right? And finally, what I call reformation, right? This is the idea of a new kind of economy, right? That has been called the stakeholder economy. Those are the 3 things that are going to have all the new jobs, all of the new money, right? That's where everything is moving. This is the prime opportunity for Brazil. All 3 of those, to digitize, of course, and to switch to renewable energy and an economy of less pollution and less fossil fuel, very, very big deal in Brazil, of course, and reformation, reforming our society, reforming business to go beyond this idea of just profit and growth. Right? I know it's a very big agenda, but this is all going to happen in the next 10 years. So you see the companies that can do this, they will prosper. And I will start with this topic just to kind of give you an idea where this is heading, right? Basically, if you're looking at this slide, it's easy to see we've made more money with business and economy for a long time. That's produced capital, more riches, more value, especially, of course, in America and in Europe. Human capital has increased a little bit, knowledge and so on, but what has completely gone down, again, especially in Brazil, is natural capital. Right? That's nature, reserves, pollution, protection, all of those things that we want around us. So nature has suffered and is about to collapse, and we have prospered. And needless to say, that is an impossible mission. And pretty much every company now has to look at this and say, what are we going to do about this? So we're looking at companies like Unilever and Patagonia and many others, who are kind of the trailblazers. And even worse, looking at this chart, you see the top issues around the world are essentially in the green sector, environmental and societal. What does that mean? Well, complex issues that everybody has to address that we can't just forget about. And the good news is this, looking at this chart here, we are looking at a future where climate technology innovation, climate tech innovation is exploding. I think Larry Fink, the guy who runs BlackRock Entertainment Investment, he says the next 1,000 billion dollar companies, the unicorns, will be in climate technology. And looking at all of these things, right? I mean, Brazilian companies are already quite strong in solar energy, for example, and other renewable resources. I mean, imagine if this takes off, we're talking about, I think the forecast is roughly $150 trillion climate change economy. Huge amount of potential. The World Economic Forum says roughly over 100 million new jobs here. If you have kids, you got to think about where they're going to work. This is a good place to start, right? And again, this chart shows how much is already happening in the sustainability revolution. Energy, right? It's the categories are being disrupted. The capacity has grown. Energy, protein, I'll talk about in a second. Food, right? Transportation and investing. Sustainable investing, right? ESG investing, everywhere. So point number one, we're heading into sustainability revolution. And don't forget it for a minute, because everything you do as a company, from R&D to marketing to distribution and branding, is going to be impacted by this. And right now, when the COVID crisis is, let's say, recovering sometime this year, normalizing as being part of our lives, hopefully, extremely painful the last 2 years for all of us, I think. But then we're going to say, well, the next revolution really is all about this. Right? And if you're not a part of that program, it's going to get very difficult. And when you think about technology, that's all great, but really what's happening is that green is the new digital. Right? And it's hard to imagine, because we talked about green. I've talked about green for, I don't know, 20 years. In fact, I started a company years ago called the Green Futurists. And now it's here, right? Green and blue, right? Big green, big blue being technology. Yeah, that's the ticket. And part of the other thing, I'll talk about that in a second, is the reformation. But we're looking at the end of oil and gas. This is a very big deal for Brazil, given, of course, your oil economy and coal burning and all of this, right? It's going to be replaced by cheaper energy through renewables, initially, of course, more expensive, but in the long run, cheaper, and the next generation nuclear power, which most people don't really like, but this is kind of part of that transition. In 10 years, we're going to go towards a point where roughly maybe 5 or so years after that, where energy will be abundant, right? Cheaper and much cheaper and everywhere. And clean, of course. Right? It's a very, very big shift. So when we talk about this, we're going to think about unthinkable changes. For example, climate tax. Again, this may not happen in Brazil anytime soon, but in Europe, we're going to see a climate tax. So you go on an airplane, you pay a mandatory carbon tax for flying. Every flight, if you eat meat, you pay the carbon tax. Right? You remember that the unthinkable idea of what has happened in the COVID crisis, like wearing masks and vaccines and all that, it's reality now. And that is our new future. Many things that were not thinkable before are normal now, becoming the new normal. For example, now you see meat that's done in the lab, what's called cultured meat here, right? Bill Gates has invested, Richard Branson has invested. There's 2 Brazilian companies who make beef, I think, in the lab. It's growing in the lab. It sounds disgusting, right? But it's actually pretty good. I tasted it. It's too expensive, but we're talking about the new source of protein that doesn't involve killing animals or growing animals. Livestock is roughly 16% of all the pollution of the world. Big thing in Brazil as well. So there's going to be lots and lots of innovation. And I love this. This is actually from Brazil, right? The Futuro burger. You gotta love this one. This is my favorite burger. I wish I could actually try it, but it's this kind of gives you an idea where things are headed. The nuclear fusion reactors are hotting up the investment. We're going to have energy from next generation nuclear that will be safe and really high output, and of course completely without well, not completely, but mostly without environmental impact and damages. Hopefully, that is of course the idea. When we talk about technology and big tech, here's a kind of scary list about all the stuff that's happening. I won't go into detail here. We can do that later in the questions. But you've seen all that stuff happening, and this is really happening everywhere. No matter what country, we're heading into a world where it's all about data, right? Social media, where we control things with our voice, where we have intelligent machines, virtual reality. And again, you can imagine that right now it's hard to say when 35 million people live in poverty. They're not going to use virtual reality glasses anytime soon, right? But this will change very, very quickly. And I think the sort of rollout of 5G means that you can do that from pretty much everywhere. So the latest thing that Mark Zuckerberg has shown, and I'm going to play a video on this in a second, is the metaverse. The idea of living in a virtual reality environment, wearing glasses or goggles, and this is now a major hype. I call it the meta perverse because most of it will not happen or won't actually be good for us. But let's take a look and see what Mark is suggesting.
Hey, are you coming?
Yeah, just got to find something to wear. All right, perfect.
Boy.
Oh, hey, Mark. Hey, what's going on?
Hi.
Mark. What's up, Mark?
Whoa, we're floating in space? Who made this?
Yes, so our friend Zuckerberg wants the whole world to live online, right? But you can only imagine what would happen here. I need a $2,000 virtual reality glass. I need a 1 gigabyte internet connection. I need a big computer. I need all kinds of devices only for the rich for the time being, right? I don't think it has much of a chance of becoming a major thing. And you can see the response in the stock market has been that Meta stock, ex-Facebook, has completely tanked last week, as they should, in my viewpoint. So here's the point about technology, and I'm sure you know about this in just every part of our daily lives. Too much of a good thing can be a very bad thing. And that is so true about technology. It's true about smoking and alcohol and coffee and eating and all of that, right? We can have too much technology. So we forget who we are. We live in fantasy land, and I can fly and I can be a superhero in virtual reality, but otherwise I live in a 2-meter home, right? Can you hear me? Yeah, all good? Yeah, okay, just checking. Yeah, okay, sorry about that. The audio stuff is a little bit disconcerting. Anyway, so let's move on from this. What happened here? So really what's important now, especially when you're thinking about your business, right? You have to find a compromise between the sort of power of technology, and it has to be ethical, right? So how you use data, how you treat your customer, you treat your customer like Facebook treats its users, that is a very bad sign for the future. So creating a sort of ethics council has been a solution. And very important, as we're all moving into a world, pretty much all of us moving into a world where there's, of course, the internet and big data and virtuality, like the Vitruvian man, right? Leonardo da Vinci, I call this the Neoluvian man. So here's the bottom line of this: the more we connect, the more we must protect what makes us human. And what makes us human? Well, that is, of course, emotions, intuition, imagination, inefficiency. Right? That has to be protected. Otherwise, what's the point, right? We're going to end up being machines. So this is the biggest problem with technology. The biggest danger is not that machines will take over. That could be a problem in 30 years. We become too much like them. We think like machines. We treat our customers like machines. Your customers aren't data; they are people. Right? And we have to consider them with a broader approach than running an algorithm. As you can see, that social media is a disaster now, primarily because of the use of too many algorithms. Right? And to that, I always say technology has no ethics. You can use technology in really bad ways and in really good ways. It's not technology fault, right? But here's the important point. It's a sort of the shield, right? Protecting ourselves from too much, protecting our customers from too much. It's not all about efficiency. It's also about keeping our humanity. And this is really our reality, right? Our reality is not that we're living in a land of being constantly connected. It's all of these things, especially in Brazil, which is a very humanistic country. And where these things really matter, as opposed to, say, for example, China or even the US, right? But the human reality is more complex than just an algorithm. And so I anticipate what's coming in the future. We're going to see what I call a digital dividend, right? In other words, all the money that technology is making from us, whether it's cloud-based or social networks or search, we're going to get something back. That proposal is already in France and also in Europe being discussed, that we have a tax on digital companies that is going to pay for us to make up, for example, for change of jobs or to allow training. It's called the digital dividend. I think that's been discussed in Brazil as well. Very interesting topic. So next on to the Reformation. Really what's happening here is that Robert Kennedy said already in 1968 that GDP, which is growth and gross domestic product, it measures everything, but not that those things that make our lives worthwhile. So what we're going to see is already unfolding around us what Al Gore called the sustainable capitalism. Right? A capitalism that looks at prosperity, at people, at planet, at purpose, and that is becoming the new normal. So you'll see the stock market change to evaluate this. The first one is already happening in San Francisco, the long-term stock exchange. And I'm really counting after the elections in Brazil on that becoming the new paradigm of government. Mm-hmm. I know that's very hopeful, isn't it? But look at Germany, right? You see what happened in Germany? You know, we had Merkel doing her 14 years. She did a pretty good job considering all of the troubles, right? But now there's a new government, and the government is saying we're going to spend 85 billion euros a year on the green economy and creating sustainable capitalism. Right? I think that's all coming here. And that also means, for example, how we work will change. And part of the good future scenario is that, you know, clearly machines are going to start doing these things. You know, machines have intellectual knowledge and logic. They have all the data, so they can use your Google Maps or automation, right? But this is the stuff that makes us human, right here. Deeper knowledge, tacit knowledge, understanding, wisdom. I'll give you an example of understanding. You know, when your kids come home from school and they tell you that they've missed the bus or, you know, they got a grade or something, and that's called logic and information. But when your kids come home and your son is looking at you and he looks really weird and strange, and you realize for the first time in his life he's fallen in love, right? That's called understanding. You know, that is not logical. And that's what we do, right? And so as an executive with your companies, or if you're in business by yourself or whatever you do, these are the things that will make you powerful. And those are the things that have to be developed. You know, the number one thing that people are asking for today from new people and companies is to ask for emotional intelligence, EQ. And how do you get that? Well, you probably won't get it by getting an MBA or having an MBA, but you know, development is a lifestyle thing. And now we're seeing all around us this huge shift, global paradigm shifts. The women are coming. I do wish that will happen in Brazil, but New Zealand, Germany, Iceland, Finland, Denmark, right? And their performance in the age of COVID has been so much better in all countries run by women. So check out Denmark, Iceland, Taiwan, of course, New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern. Global paradigm shift. You're going to see in the next 10 years more women, more minorities, and younger people entering politics. And we see that shift coming in. By the way, I predict that in America, we're going to see Biden resign and Kamala Harris take over, probably in something like 2 or 3 years. And again, you know, that's a huge paradigm shift we're seeing here. So to wrap up, the question is, what do we do now? Right? Well, first, again, I urge you to understand that the future is better, because here's the problem. When you think of the future as not being good, then you act differently. And there's a saying by Barbara Hubbard, who was a great futurist working with Buckminster Fuller, and she said, as we see the future, so we act, and as we act, so we become. So you see the future badly, that's going to impact on your work. There's many things to worry about, but in principle, we hold the solution right here. We just have to understand things better, and we have to make better decisions. So in a nutshell, that's kind of going to be our mission, I think, also in business. And then this idea, right, a lot of people feel like they can't do anything about it. Like a turtle lying on the back, you know, waiting to be flipped over. Well, that's not what it is, right? We make the future. Our companies make the future. We make the future. We do nothing. We also make the future. Right? By doing something, we change the future. And the future is not something that is fixed. As you can see right now with climate change, we already are seeing global warming on the current trajectory. It's going to be around the 2 degrees in the next 20 years of warming. And there's no way around that, really. We don't want it to be 4 or 5. That will be the end of it, pretty much. But 2 degrees, yeah, and then we can work on something to replenish, and we take the CO2 out. So basically, the action that we're taking now is going to really impact absolutely everything. And the choice that we have, I think, as people and as companies, is to shape the future or to be shaped by it. Is to have other people make the rules, or we make the rules and we invent. Again, keep in mind the next 10 years, we're looking at this, right? New paradigms, new priorities, new narratives, and new rules. And that is all coming. So basically, that is a change process that is coming towards us that we have to understand and be ready for. And here's the important question in that future. The question is not what will the future bring. That is a question of disempowerment. Like you're the subject of, whatever, Silicon Valley or China, somebody else makes the future. No, what do we want our future to be? That is the number one question. Your personal future, your kids' future, and that's the decision that we make today. And of course, your companies and your country's vision of what we want the future to be. Because imagine in 10 years, you want to upload your brain to the internet, it's going to be possible. You want to change your genome so you won't get diabetes? That's maybe 15 years from now. So the question isn't so much about what we can do, but what we want to do. Well, sorry about that. I'm going to spare you that film because you can't hear that anyway, unless I switch it again. So that was my short presentation on the future. So I would encourage you to do the following first. One is essentially to spend an hour a day on the future, in the future. We're not talking about watching Netflix now. We're talking about reading great books, reading about the future, looking at, listening to podcasts, getting wise about what's coming. That is the best thing you can do for yourself, for your family, for your company, because that will change the way that you think about things. Right? So 1 hour a day is all I ask. And if you run a company, that should be the policy for everybody. Because the future isn't about tomorrow, right? The future is a mindset. And that future mindset we can nurture and develop only by moving into the thinking along with today. So what's really important, I think, for most people now is what I call the hybrid thinking, right? So you operate today and you run your company today, but then there's also tomorrow, which you already are, with one leg in the future. And that is the hybrid concept, of moving through windows. So that's kind of like so far so good, and let's start talking.
Okay.
Okay.
So Gerd, I'm going to kick off this conversation with an initial question and then open for other questions from the members of our group. Okay. We talk a lot about speed and magnitude of change. Expected for the next years. But sometimes we come across with skeptic executives who tend to downplay such transformations by saying, look, change have always been the only constant in the business world. There is nothing particularly different now. So my question is, how can we respond to these skeptics? Why is this specific historic period that we are living uniquely important, and the next few years are likely to determine our collective fate? So what makes today different from, let's say, 20 years ago? And you mentioned oil and gas. You are in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia at this moment, right? And they are already thinking beyond oil and gas, for example.
Well, they're trying to. It's a difficult mission, right? But to be sure, basically what is happening is that a lot of things that were kind of thought about as the future, they didn't happen, or they happened much later. And basically what is happening now is that we see this sort of takeoff point, It's like when something is a good idea, then it goes a little bit like this, and then there's a pivot point, and then it just explodes, right? So take, for example, what happened in the music business where I used to be in, right? We talked for 10 years about selling music on the internet, right? It didn't happen because, why didn't it happen? Because there was no iPhone and there was no 4G. And there wasn't a way of doing the deal with the record companies, right? So what happened in 2007, Spotify came up, right? And Spotify said, we'll do this. It took 3 years. And all of a sudden, everybody said, I'm not buying any more CDs. I'm using on the iPhone, and I do it for free or I pay. But what has happened now is we have 160 million people paying $10 a month, right? That's 1.6 billion a month of new money when the pivot point is reached. So if you are skeptical about progress, I would say you take a look at 20 things like 3D printing. And we talked about 3D printing, I don't know, 30 years, right? Printing stuff with a digital printer, right? But now you go to the hospital, and what are they doing to if you have a dental problem, for example, you go to the dentist, they are printing your temporary crown with a 3D printer, right? And now you go to the hospital, they're printing your kneecap for your operation with a 3D printer, right? And you go to the airport and they're printing the engine piece for the engine with a 3D printer, right? So now in China, they're printing houses, right? So they have a huge machine that drives across the lot, and it prints 400 houses with new kinds of concrete, right? So basically, if somebody is skeptical about the speed, I would have about 500 examples, like with the electric vehicle, electric car, right? I don't think there are too many people who are driving Teslas. There may be a few, but it's not a big adoption yet. But in Norway, 60% of people drive electric cars. Right? That's because of subsidy, because of a good network of loading station policy, right? And now the prediction is that you have to understand what this means for the entire car industry, right? Very few people in 5 years will buy a normal car with a normal engine. Right? Like everybody is going to go electric, because when the battery takes you 500 kilometers and the car is half of the other car, right? And you have to pay to pollute, which is coming, right? The pivot point is here. And the story goes on. So if you have an issue with understanding technology, it's a suicidal argument, right? Some things like, if you want to solve cancer by genetic engineering, who knows? But if you're in the pharma industry, for example, you know that we're not going to be taking as many pills in 10 years as we take today, because we're going to use technology to avoid the pills, right? We're going to use analytics, and we're going to have our data on the cloud. And so basically, I always say when I speak to CEOs and the government executives and ministers, which I did just yesterday, I say you need a driver's license for the future, right? And that's basically you have to pass the future test. Right? So if I meet a CEO of a company, I say, can you tell me what your company is going to look like in 5 years, right? And many people are saying, well, kind of like today, just more efficient and faster and making more money, right? Now that is a bad answer, because that's not the future, that's a hope, right? That you can do that. The future is to say, well, in 5 years, maybe an airline is going to sell virtual travel tickets. Right? That is coming. Right? And when I proposed this to Lufthansa and Swiss, 10 years ago, I said, you should build a virtual airplane and sell tickets where I can go into a holographic room and go to Brazil for my talk and show up there. I'll pay you $500. And I thought I was crazy, but this is coming now. So just as an example.
Yes, and perhaps, as you say, we have this linear mindset, whereas the technologies goes exponentially, and so it's a game changer, right? So it's totally different.
Right. The important part really is that we need to have imagination, right, and courage, because really what is happening, especially in business education, is that we're taught that imagination and courage and intuition is bad, right? Because it's not efficient. Right? So what happens with a lot of training, that we are taught to be robots. Right? And I went to school, I studied philosophy, and then I studied music. And you are taught that you're learning things and you keep in the parameters and you function, right? But functioning isn't going to be the future. Function is what machines do. Right? So as I'd like to say, if you work like a robot will take your job. And this is so true, especially for Brazil, because of so many jobs on a low level of payment, right? And a lot of machines will take those jobs like welding and cleaning, and just go to the airport in Tokyo. you see a machine, not one, thousands, that do all the cleaning, that do the windows, that do the floors, that do the toilets. Right? Cleaners are gone. Think about that, what that means for the future.
Great. Angela, please.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Gerd, for being here. I must say I found your metaphor about the Moore's law, the exponential growth. It's brilliant for computer capacity. That we need to change now that we are in the step 2 or 3 around our office or our kitchen, and in the step 30 will be in the moon, right? So, and we must not act when we'll be in the step 27 because we'll end up in the moon, certainly. And my question is about the future, the humanity. Your allegation that the future is human, and what is humanity? And as you said, and we talked here a little bit before, it's characterized by empathy, to be able to care, to be able to deep connection, to listen, to cooperate, etc. But what we see is that our political leaders and our business leaders, they were not trained to be like that, of course. And for instance, in Brazil, and we have here about 93% of white men on boards, and C-level the same. And this reality didn't change in the last 15 years. So we suppose that it will be the same because we didn't see a relevant shift. And we know that our society created gender roles, right? Prescriptive and descriptive stereotypes based on gender that says men must be and behave like that, agently, self-assertion, having answers for everything, not listen independently, and while society says women must behave and be the other way, so behave gently, act and think collectively, be compassive, and etc. But as you mentioned, the countries that were much better in the COVID crisis were the countries that were led by women. But we are not seeing the changes that we need in the path that we need in our business and our companies and our political world and political parties. So they're or either they don't change or they change very slowly. So in your view, what is the future of gender, or do we have a future with the gender constructs that we have now with these stereotypes?
Yeah, well, first, that's a complex question. Now, first, populists and political leaders that are more on the autocratic side, they will not survive this crisis, right? They are not surviving the COVID crisis because they've done very bad things, like Trump. Right? I mean, remember that, if it wasn't for COVID, we would still have Donald Trump as the president in America. Right? All other countries around the world, in Turkey, Hungary, and other countries, and last not least in Brazil, people who are not good leaders and haven't led well are going to be disposed because they haven't worked. Right? And this is a global trend. And the countries that have worked, again, New Zealand, if you're looking at Jacinda Ardern, just check out a few things about her. She said the other day in Parliament that the utmost principle of running the government and towards the citizen is kindness, right? I mean, would you hear that from a man, like any man? Apart from myself, maybe, but yeah. So I think what we're seeing there is a lot of movement towards asking for actual performance and compassion and empathy, and that is not going to be the exception in Brazil. My view on that is it will probably get worse before it gets better, which means a year or two of ongoing discussions of people who want to hold on to power, for example, Putin, who are doing things in ways that is not good for the future. And the same goes for companies and CEOs. I mean, look at all the CEOs who are now all of a sudden they have to take a position on things, on important things, and they have, and what happened in Glasgow at the climate change conference, right? It's all of the bullshit basically about doing nothing, but the result is that the pressure is gigantic, right? To make big changes, and so I'm quite positive that we're going to see this. And lastly, I think if you want this to change in Brazil, then you have to use the Gandhi logic. Gandhi said, if 5% of the customers and citizens, users, whatever, are actively seeking for change, then you have a movement, right? A 5%, because the 5% will egg on the 50% very quickly, right? So if that happens in all companies and you change the gender-specific scenarios and you refuse and you demand change, then 5% is enough to get you to the 50, right? By the way, I'm totally convinced that most companies are now realizing already diversity, inclusion, and openness makes more money than anything else, right? So if they want to make more money, they're not going to stick to the agenda of 30 years ago, right? And on top of it, the last point on this, the millennials are coming, right? The generation Y, between 24 to 35 kind of range, right? A little bit older now too, because of COVID, right? And they are the most powerful players in the next few years that are coming into the power position. So for example, if you go to business meetings, and many countries, used to be also in Turkey, but I go to many countries where all of a sudden I realize, that 70% of the people in the room running the company are women, and they're between 30 and 40. I go back to Germany, it's guys my age, right? 90%. Right? That can't be good. So I think this is really, it's changing quickly, and we have to ask for it, and we have to be prepared for what happens when the millennials come in, because the millennials don't care about the rules from people like me, the baby boomers, and that is, the chapter is closing.
Great. And Edson, please.
Hi, Gerd. First of all, thank you very much for joining us this morning. Congrats for your wonderful and brilliant presentation. Primarily, if I understood correctly, your proposition as this future is going to be better than we think. But, and for sure, I agree pretty much that many ESG agenda, diversity agenda, etc., is increasing and getting better in certain sense. But being honest, I recently am more pessimistic about some points, for example, in Brazil and other parts of the world. You mentioned that Brazil is a humanistic country, for example, and recently you had such a tremendous horrible events with violence, with people from immigrants and the poor people, etc., African, Brazilian people, etc. My question for you, Gerd, is what's the rule of pessimistic thinking, not only optimistic thinking? Because on one hand, for sure, being optimistic can drive us to a attitude to imagination and being utopian, etc. is pretty good, pretty important for us leaders. However, thinking pessimistically can also, in my view, have a pretty important role, being the driving people to be critic and driving people to understand the more profundity, for example, the role of technology, etc. My question, being more quick in my question, is what's the rule of pessimism in the world we live in?
Great question. I think basically I would say that I prescribe to the idea of intellectual pessimism, but emotional optimism. It's like, yes, you have to be, you can't be stupid and naive, but you also can't be depressed. And I think this is one of the things that is really a major, when you're running a company and you're working every day and going through all of the hard things, right? So facing reality, but also, of course, that depends on where you are looking, right? So, for example, if you take this old exercise and you're taking the Roman number X, which is 10, and 1, which is the dash, right? You put them together and then you flip them, the result is different, right? The viewpoint has changed, right? So it's all about the question. I think Henry Miller once said, our future is never a destination, but a new way of seeing things. And so it is important that we see the possibilities and we recognize them, and we also avoid the sources of despondency. Despondency means having a bad view of the world, right? So that is basically pretty much every show on Netflix, for example, when it's about the future, except for Don't Look Up. And news, media, social media, avoid, because, you know, on social media, you're getting 5 or 6 times as much power from the negative things than you get from the positive things, right? So that can be kind of a mental pollution, you know? So I prefer to read books that get me informed. For example, I'm reading Christina Figueres on the future of the world. It's a climate change book, that the only positive book I can think of in climate change, right? And I read books that make me feel like I can do something, right? And it's a little bit like, I don't know if you've ever been to therapy with your husband or your wife. When you go there with the idea of saying it's all basically messed up, right? Nothing I can do, it's all somebody else's fault, you know? With that attitude, you're definitely not going to save your marriage, or, you know, it's basically, you have to get to the point of saying, you know what, I can be in charge of something, right? So I would say that we have to be realistic, but also, of course, there's a filter. For example, when you look at data, like, you know, the other day I gave a talk about the global population issue, right? And so there's lots of talk, and I can present data like this. I can say, okay, we had last year 280,000 women who died in childbirth labor. That died because they were giving birth, right? That sounds really terrible. Right? But then when you look back, and I could say that is only 8% of all of the women that died in childbirth 20 years ago, right? So the fact this one is positive, the other one is negative, right? So I can use data in so many different ways. It's not all conclusive, right? If you want to prove that the world is bad and humans are bad, there's plenty of examples. And sometimes I say that to be too pessimistic is just mental laziness, because it's so easy to say, you know, this all sucks. It doesn't go anywhere, right? Especially in Brazil, I think this is a huge problem, because every time there's an issue, we say, oh, we can't do anything because X, Y, Z doesn't, you know, do the right thing, you know. But in the end, it's really up to us to make those changes happen on an economic and political and private level, right? And to do the right job with our kids, for example, to have them to change it, right? But I'm always asking myself, you know, when I look at the future, it's like, you know, I'm 60 years old. I'm going to see a little bit of that future, but I'm wondering, you know, what kind of future will I create for my kids and my grandkids? Because that is the key question, you know. So that will make me behave differently, and I really think that, you know, because of the COVID crisis, we are ready for change like never before. You know, many of us had people who died from COVID that were relatives, people that we know. Terrible things have happened, right? Yes, it could have been much worse, but, you know, we went through hell, you could say, in many ways, right? And now in 22, I think in Brazil it will take a little bit longer, but we're moving towards the end of the year, sort of a rebound, right? A normalization and I think the next 10 years will be very chaotic, but they may also include a kind of strange golden era. Like, you know, after a major crisis, you often see like a huge rebound, right? And that may very well be true for Brazil. I predict it will take until 23 for that to happen in Brazil. But in Europe, that's happening now already. So yeah, it may get worse this year, but it's temporary.
And Gerd, this was such a great exchange. And actually, one of the books that we're going to debate in this program is Humankind, a hopeful story, which is written by Dutch Rutger Bregman. So
yes.
We believe that everything departs from a positive premise about human beings, because cynicism is a great enemy, right? And this is what fosters this nihilistic view of the world at the end, right? So
well,
very nice.
there's a great saying about humans, which is derived from Winston Churchill. What he said about Americans, he said, you can always trust Americans to do the right thing after they tried everything else. And that was about Americans. Now, I would say you can always trust humans to find a way to collaborate and to do the right thing after we've tried everything else. And I think really the bottom line is that we can, and we're perfectly capable. You know, we collaborated after Hiroshima and Nagasaki to not have the world kill itself with nuclear bombs. And we're still doing it. We're still in the same framework, right? Can we collaborate for climate change? We can. But, you know, at first there has to be some really tough moments. Hopefully not something like Hiroshima, you know, but basically we are capable once we get to it, you know. And I think that is so true for Brazil, perfectly capable of doing this, but a long detour in the last 6-7 years, you know, through not doing much. But that could result in sort of a rebirth of that concept. I think that is quite likely.
Great. And Mara, please.
First of all, thank you, Gerd, for being here with us and sharing your thoughts and having this opportunity is really wonderful. Thanks, Alexandre, as well.
You're welcome.
My question is more of a practical one, and it's based on 3 main things that I had the opportunity to see you talking about or read you through the material that you sent. Given that the future will probably not be an extension of the present. And something else that you said that we should be exponentially imaginative in order to keep up with the velocity of the changes, the exponential changes.
Mm-hmm.
I was trying to connect that with your technique. I don't know if I can say technique that you use that. It's not that you are in the present and you try to imagine the future. From what I understood, you kind of like, you put yourself in the future and kind of work backwards. I was really interested in that. And my question is, could you please extrapolate a little bit more on this technique? Maybe, I don't know, with an illustrative example or something?
Yes, great point. I think, you know, the dangerous thing is that because we're human, you know, we tend to think of a linear world, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's because we are linear. You know, we get older and we get better, but we don't leap, you know, because we're organic, you know. But technology doesn't do that. You know, if technology is working, then it's always leaping. I mean, look at you know, my mobile phone has the same computing power than the machine that brought the Americans to the moon. You know, I mean, I could run the whole moon operation from the iPhone, you know, in terms of computing power, right? So the way I always say this, what we have to do is we have to go into the future, you know, 5, 8, maybe 10 years, and we have to try to understand what is possible in that future. And that is not science fiction because most of these things are already here, right? For example, when I think about money, banking, insurance, money, I go into the future and I say, oh, you know, I think in 10 years, we're going to have digital money. The global currency will not be the dollar. It'll be a digital money, not Bitcoin, but, you know, state digital money, right? We're going to probably use money in digital ways everywhere, right? By and large. And the cost of getting money, transferring money will be next to zero, right? And so when I realize that this is likely to happen, then I can take this information and say, okay, now I'm here working at the bank and we charge for money transfers, you know, what does that mean if their future is like this, right? And then I have a choice. I can say, okay, we continue as long as we can, and then we crash, or we make a decision to pursue the new future, right? So what Elon Musk has done about the electric car, he looked at all of those companies like BMW, Mercedes, and everybody else, and he said what they're doing is they're building better engines, right? and making it more energy efficient and, you know, making it go faster. And then he said, that's not what I'm going to do, because I think in 10 years, we're going to have batteries big enough to drive the car electrically and with technology. And so his car is a software car, right? It's not physical, it's software, right? And he started from that and he wiped out everybody else. And now Tesla's valuation, I think it's 2 or 3 times of Mercedes, Benz, and Audi together. Right? And will they catch up? Yes, they will. You know, good German companies, but they're going to pay trillions to catch up. Right? So, and this is, of course, it's a game, right? So, for example, in tourism, when you think about what is the future of tourism, you have to think about that our behavior around tourism isn't going to work here, right? Because, you know, we're destroying what we visit, basically, right? So then you go 10 years into the future, say, what would that look like? And you investigate, and then you come back, right? So basically, you come back from the future rather than going into the future, right? Because we tend to just think of that as a gradual process. Right? But believe me, if you spend 1 hour a day on looking at your areas, you're reading the books, and the best book to read right now, I think it's available in Portuguese, not Brazilian, but Portuguese version. I think it's Kim Stanley Robinson, it's a science fiction, KSR, that's his nickname, the biggest current science fiction hit. It's called The Ministry for the Future. The Ministry for the Future. And he talks about the world in 2031, but it feels very much like today. And it's not science fiction like the Mars trilogy or something, you know, it's basically today. And that will give you some ideas about how to imagine the next 10 years and how to deal with this, right? The Ministry for the Future, Kim Stanley Robinson. So I think this is really the attitude, and this is why I talk about the future mindset, right? If you're 25 or 45 or 65, you can have a future mindset. And this is the only thing that's going to guarantee your future employment, right? Because nobody is going to let go of a person that understands the future, and no matter what job you have. Right? Because believe me, most people are running companies, they are running on a quarterly basis. They don't see the future, they see the past. Right? And if you take the present and you make it longer into the future, you will almost certainly be wrong, because every condition around you has changed. And the other thing is that the speed of things means the future is no longer about tomorrow. You know, 10 years ago, I talk about the future, I talk about ideas, you know, concepts. Today, when I talk about the future, I have proof, right? I can show you the guy that uploads the brain to the internet, right? I mean, the future is here, we just haven't paid attention. And so when we pay more attention, then we can make our future.
So Gerd,
Thank you.
Do you recommend the Ministry for the Future even more than Brave New World from?
you read them together. You know, there's I mean, there's lots of great books on this now. It's pretty amazing all the things that have come out on this topic. But you know, to develop foresight, which means to look ahead, it's just so mission critical now for everybody. Because, you know, 10 or 20 years ago, we used to drive on the digital highway very slowly. So if you're driving, for example, in Los Angeles in a car, you go maybe an average of 20 miles per hour, mostly traffic jams, right? I mean, you can sleep, you can drive a self-driving car, you can eat, you can, no problem, right? Because you don't need to look ahead very much, you know. But if you're driving on the German highway, you go 250 kilometers an hour in a big car. If you don't look ahead, you're toast. Right? And we're now driving on a highway that is not just 250K, it's like 1,000. Right? So before we know it, we're there. Right? That's why it's so important to have foresight.
Yeah, great. Isabel, please.
Thank you, Gerd. Thank you very much, Gerd, for being here. I feel very honored to hear you and your thoughts. Well, in an interesting video that we recently watched about a good future, you say that one of our priorities should be investing time to understand and to learn about the future in order to help creating this good future that we want. We need to develop a future mindset, which means, for instance, do not invest by market shares or by products from companies that are not committed to this good future. But considering this crisis of confidence that our global society is experiencing today, with research that demonstrates that the people do not believe in the information given by our governmental and business leaders, and considering the huge amount of information that we're facing also today, what is your suggestion so we can find out how true is the information that these companies are providing to all of us? And how can we find out if the real purpose of these companies is directed towards this good future?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, the bottom line is really quite simple. I always say you are what you read, and you certainly are what you eat. We already know that. But also you are what you watch, and you end up doing for what you see a lot. Right? So you surround yourself with people who are of negative nature, then you get drafted into this, and you're watching too many things that are going to leave you sad. That is impacting your life, right? And so to think positive includes a certain amount of filtering, right? And also, I think when you know emotionally and intuitively when something is true. So if you get married to somebody, there's a certain moment where that this is true, is what you want to do, right? But there's no statistic and no certainty. It's just what you think is true. Right? And I think when we think about understanding things, it's going to be largely about intuition, and to develop understanding. And there's no proof. Yeah? So you can't prove anything here. This is just the understanding that you have. And the best example is Jeff Bezos, former CEO of Amazon, who always talks about how much data he's using and the focus groups and the studying is, and he says everybody has to bring data. But in the end, the other day at an event, he said, the way I decide things in my life and with Amazon, with my company, is based on gut feel, imagination, and intuition. Right? And that's all we have. Maybe it's sad that we don't have proof, but if life could be proven in such a way, it would probably be pretty boring. So I think really it comes down to leadership. So, for example, you also create realities by what you believe is true or not. So, and that is very true, I think, for politics. To convince people to change is a question of that they believe the change is good. Right? So I think that is the hard part, and to evangelize in your company like this, and to tell your customer. Mark Benioff, the CEO of Salesforce, is a brilliant thinker. He said the other day, our job really is to get to the future before our customer and our client arrives, and to greet them when they finally get there. And that is just so true for everything, because and the customer and our clients and our partners, they will appreciate that we're already there, right? And they can trust us. And remember that human business does not come down to logic. Right? It comes down to trust, because that's how our brain works. We don't care much for the numbers, really. We like numbers, but I can prove numbers with anything. So it's basically the only question is like, who do I trust? What relationships I have? And what do I believe to be true?
Fantastic, Gerd. Fantastic. Lucia, please.
Do we still have time?
Yes, we talked to Gerd.
Okay.
He kindly, very, very kindly allowed us for a couple of extra minutes. So thank you so much, Gerd, and publicly now, once again, for your double generosity, for being here and for allowing us for a couple more minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, I have about 5 minutes because my next conference is starting.
Okay. Thank you, Gerd, for your insights. I have a special worry about social inequality. Will all this change move social inequality for what sense? Is there an economic order in course to address the global social inequality, like universal minimum income? And who cares about poor countries?
Yeah, also a very good question. I think the bottom line is that technology or exponential technology, any of this will not change human, cultural, political issues, right? Technology is something practical. It changes practical things like water, food, energy, but technology will not solve our political problems. It makes them worse, right? I mean, look at social media. We thought that social media would solve that we weren't hearing the truth, but it did the opposite, right? Because it became a factor of power of companies rather than media companies, right? So if we want to solve inequality, there is no shortcut on that is based on some technology or something. These are political issues that we have to address on that level, and they would be easy to solve because technology actually makes so much money that if we were to distribute it, we would have the money, right? For example, as I said earlier, the dividend, right? I call the digital dividend, right? So if the internet companies around the world would pay a digital dividend to the citizens, right, or the organizations representing the citizens, right, we could bring everybody forward very easily. But the decision to get a tax from the companies is a huge political step, right? So the way that we can do this and take charge of this is to stop doing business with companies that don't help, and to refuse to collaborate with the likes of Facebook, which I've done. I stopped speaking for Facebook and using Facebook 4 years ago, and to make choices of who we vote for, of course, but also to ask for things, right? And so inequality is the other thing has happened because of COVID. Inequality has gotten worse because of COVID, right? For example, women are much more the victim of COVID than men. Because women were supposed to stay at home and be with the kids, while the men would go back and work in the home office, and so we have all of these things. But there has been a deep polarization, and I think really what's happening now is that people are sick and tired of the results of inequality, which is crime, mental unhealth, and so on, and that is now becoming a top-level concern. So I think we're going to see a lot of action on this, and it's kind of worrisome that in some ways Brazil has followed the natural history of the United States, which is polarization of income and injustice, which is normal in America. It's extreme, right? And the only thing I can say about Brazil, if Brazil could get away from copying America on this, then it would be a great benefit to start creating different social strategies and capital strategies. So I think what's going to happen here, in a nutshell, America will try to switch to the sustainable capitalism. That's already happening. But this could be Brazil's agenda. A progressive, human-centric, sustainable, equal kind of new capitalism, right, that becomes the driver of the economy. And a big part of that is to redistribute the income and give it to those that need it most, which is usually the subject of tax discussions and things like that, right? So hard to say, I'm not a great expert on Brazil, but I think that time is coming for that conversation much more than ever before. The bottom line also on this is that nobody can live in peace and prosper when all of the neighbors are not. Right? And this has become also clear in the crisis. So yeah, sorry, I don't have better news, but again, I think it may get worse for this year until it gets better.
Well, Gerd, wow, such a wonderful conversation, and with your humanistic perspective. And actually, there is a quote from you that says that the work of the future is to be human, right? So, and I think we have a lot of opportunities here in Brazil because you know very well our culture, but unfortunately, and you have anticipated which would be my last question, because we have emulated a wrong model, you know, the Anglo-Saxon model. We try to be and to behave and to work exactly like, you know, the Anglo-Saxons, and I think that we have other great potentials and possibilities. So it was fantastic to listen to you, and on behalf of this group, would like to deeply thank you once again for the generosity of your time, for being us with here. This was for sure a memorable occasion for all of us. And well, it will be a privilege to hopefully meet you once again at some point in the future. So congratulations and for your beautiful work. And
thank you. I do hope to be back in Brazil. I mean, I'm booked to be at the Olympic what is it called? The Olympic Congress in Salvador, in Bahia, in March for the International Olympic Committee. I hope it will happen. But if you happen to be there on March 17, 18, 19, then you know we can have a caipirinha.
Oh, fantastic, fantastic. Wonderful. So
all
thank
right,
you
then.
once again. See
Thank
you.
you, Gerd. Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Gerd. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Excelente, hein, pessoal? Muito bom. Os que ficaram aí, os heróis da resistência. Mestre Cabreira, ó, Luiz Alexandre, o mestre aí, ó. Falei que ele estava aí.
Tchau. Aí, Cabreira, tudo bem? Tudo bem a todos?
Alexandre,
Oi, Marrolo.
Tchau. Obrigado, Alexandre. Tchau.
Oi,
Alexandre estava conversando com o Andy que você vai ter que ter espaço debaixo das asas de vocês dois aí, você e Ângela, para aguentar muitos filhos, viu? Porque Andy entrou aqui e disse: oi, Olga, que bom te ver aqui. Aí ele disse que era da turma anterior, né? Eu conheci o Andy recentemente, a gente tem conversado bastante. E ele disse: eu sou da turma anterior e não saio mais. Eu virei para ele e disse: olha, o professor Alexandre e Ângela vão ter que ter muitas asas para aguentar muitos filhos pela prosperidade, né? E a gente não vai largar mais.
Não, nós também. Somos irmãos, né? Acho que é mais apropriado.
A gente é que tem vontade de ter mais tempo para se encontrar mais, porque realmente é muito bom, é energizante. Obrigada a todos, viu, pessoal?
Obrigada, boa semana.
Tchau,
obrigado.
Até amanhã,
Tchau.
até amanhã.
Até amanhã, verdade. Até amanhã.
Tchau.
Até amanhã.
Com o professor Gui. Tá bom, tchau.
Abraço, tchau.